Right, thanks very much everyone. Thanks very much Eamonn for that. That was really great, and there are several points that Eamonn has made that I'm going to be taking up on as well. But in fact, rather than talking about the forthcoming budget, what I want to do is talk a little bit about the context, the Irish context of budget decision making, and then widen it out into the European, some aspects of the European decision making process and the consequences of austerity across Europe more generally, and especially amongst those countries who, like Ireland, are in loan programmes, that is Greece and Portugal, or like Spain, who are in imminent risk of needing big bailout money. So the four questions that I have about the politics of austerity are, first of all, about its fairness, about the distributed consequences of making tough budgetary choices. Then I want to ask, is it actually something that is going to be manageable at all? Is it attainable? The whole logic of imposing a whole lot of austerity at European level is to gain credibility to generate more growth. Is this plausible? And the final question I want to ask is it really politically sustainable? And I think there are big problems around that ultimately. So the equity question is very serious. I mean, you can't open a newspaper these days without coming across discussions about, even today, for example, on the one hand, the still very favourable tax treatment of private sector pensions, the compensation packages for senior bankers and indeed for politicians and senior civil servants, public sector pensions as opposed to private sector pensions, and on the other hand, the hardships experienced by people who are in receipt of benefits or who find it difficult to access services due to cutbacks, the re-emergence in Ireland of food poverty, which we could not have imagined 10 years ago, even 5 years ago. So the equity considerations are very serious. This great big red line, red arrow, shows us that the government is committed to cutting back spending year on year. And the extent of the correction, fiscal correction that Eamonn has told us about is to be achieved with a combination of spending cuts and tax increase at a ratio of 2 to 1. So there's going to be more spending cuts than tax increases. That's how the Irish government has decided to do it. We have no choice about the scale of the fiscal correction that is to be undertaken. We do have a choice about the means, and this is the means our governments have chosen, and there's been no change with the change of government in that composition. But there is discretion about how this is to be managed and about who it's going to hit. Are you going to cut down on the direct spending that goes in transfers, or are you going to cut down on the public spending that goes on employing people, and what combination you're going to do that in? And how you do that has huge implications for equity, for justice. If you, for example, in the course of a recession, you have very large numbers claiming benefits, large rise in unemployment mean that you have to spend a lot more money in benefits. This red line shows a big surge in the demand on benefits. But we see this red line tailing off because what the government has done is put a cap on the amount. It's trying to push down the amount that's going on transfer payments, unemployment, child benefits, and so on. So they're controlling the spending through reducing the volume of money being spent. It's much harder to control public sector pay more generally because of the Cook-Park Agreement at the moment. And so what the government has been doing is trying to squeeze back on the amount of money that goes on the public service by holding back the numbers of people. And this is having big effects in health services, in the spending on health services, with very immediate effects, palpable effects in the delivery of frontline services and also in education. So that combination, who takes the hit and how it is done, is a seriously political question with very big distributed consequences, and that's very problematic because people will accept austerity to a certain point if they believe it is equitable. But the political problems arise when people believe that there's a lot of unfairness and that some people are being unfairly treated and that the hardships are being distributed in ways that are socially unacceptable. Same story comes up when we look at revenue. Taxes have to be increased, and you can see the huge drop in tax intake with the collapse of the construction boom. And so the government is left trying to reorient the whole construction of the tax system at the same time as trying to raise more taxes and raise taxes on new sources. Well, do we like paying taxes? No, not very much, and this is something that generates resistance and tax revolt. And again, the debate is very often now about how the tax increases are going to be managed. Who's going to take the hit? Is it going to be, as people perceive, on lower income households, as in many people believe that the universal social charge affected them disproportionately, on household taxes, or on the tax treatment of private sector pensions? These, again, are very contentious issues. When we try to consider what the overall impact has been of budgetary changes and adjustments over the last few years, the ESRI, with their modelling activities, have argued that, in fact, the overall impact, if you look at these red bars, the overall effect of the budgets since 2008, including the public sector pay cuts, has had a much more severe impact on the top income households and the top decile, that they have been affected much more severely than the lowest income households. But on the other hand, if you concentrate on those pink bars there, this is the effect of budget 2012, and it's particularly the universal social charge, and that was in fact regressive in impact. And that, alongside the introduction of new forms of taxation that are going to affect people directly in their pockets, not out of their payroll, sort of invisibly just wafted off, but if you're going to be faced with a bill for a household charge that you're going to have to find directly to pay, that is going to be very contentious again. And I think we can see the politics of resistance to some of these changes is very likely to increase over time. So the next question is attainability. How easy is it, how even credible, how plausible is it that all these targets are not going to be met? Now, Ireland is doing much better than other countries in the other southern European countries, but there's actually a whole bunch of countries that have made enormous fiscal efforts over the last few years. Look at this, it's the scale of fiscal adjustment. It's the achievement, the improvement in the government's primary balance as a proportion of GDP over the last 3 years. And Greece, although it's in a fiscal mess at the moment, and although its debt is enormous and probably would simply never be able to service it, in spite of what the ECD says, or the European Commission, which you just don't want to have to look at that problem right now, it has actually made really, really large gains in improving its primary balance. But the problem is, and as is Ireland, and as Portugal, and as Spain, much, much more severe austerity in these countries than in any other European countries that are having to do some budget twiddling around the edges. At the moment, very severe adjustments. But the problem is that they're chasing a moving target. So this is coming at huge cost in terms of standards of living. Look at the yellow bar here, the drop in GDP, the reduction in the scale of economic activity, about 1/10 of to the extent of about 1/10 of total GDP, and consumption down even more. And you can see that in Greece, and even more so in the Baltic states, the suffering that has been imposed through these fiscal adjustments has been enormous. And the consequence, of course, the most immediately visible consequence is huge increases in the rise in the scale of unemployment. Loads of people losing their livelihood, losing their jobs, losing their income. And a drop in the overall level of economic activity in the economy, just sheer waste of human capacity, and a destruction of hope for an entire generation. And Ireland is right up there. You can see the huge surge in increase in unemployment. An interesting feature of this is that, look down here, Germany has actually had experienced an improvement in its unemployment situation since 2008. In Germany, they don't actually see recession at the moment, and so that's one of the reasons why the debate is so hard to bring home to them in Germany. It's not visible around them. They've had 20 years of belt tightening, but they're not actually having the present recession in any palpable degree at all. So the deficit projections, in fact, that are being measured as a proportion of GDP, governments are doing all this fiscal consolidation, but because it's being measured as a proportion of GDP, which is shrinking, the scale of what's yet to be achieved is growing. And so they're running to stand still. They're trying to hit moving targets because of the way these targets are calibrated. And that is going to be, I think, just a huge problem over the next couple of years. This is just proven, as I say, Ireland is doing quite well on these metrics. The other southern European countries are not. But this is very problematic for the management of the whole politics of austerity. Why are we doing all this at all anyway? Well, in Ireland, I suppose we've told ourselves we have to. As we said, 20 years ago, we had this budgetary crisis. Get on top of it fast, get the budget back into whack, and then be okay. Inside a monetary union, though, the logic is very different. It's not clear that even by doing all this, buying all this pain, we will actually gain in terms of growth eventually, because what lifted us off the rocks 25 years ago was international growth in the context of an Irish devaluation. Well, neither of those things are present these days. The logic of imposing austerity on everyone at the same time, making everyone shrink down their budgets, damp down their economic activity, hold in their budgets all at once, is that it will increase credibility in the markets. It will make the markets more confident in government's capacity to borrow, and it will make investors more confident. It will make ordinary households more willing to spend because they believe their taxes will go down in the future. It will make investors more willing to engage in private sector economic investment. That's the logic. That's why fiscal contraction is supposed to be a good contributor to economic growth. But it seems to me that in the context of a Europe-wide austerity programme, all at once, in the middle of a downturn, this pro-cyclical policy is simply going to reinforce itself in the ways that Eamonn has described to us. And what we really need is a different sort of tack at a European-wide level to introduce confidence through increasing the hope that there will be some growth to float us off the rocks. But that's not what's happening. This is a map of a graph of the ratings agencies' assessments of Irish sovereign debt. So if fiscal contraction, fiscal adjustment, was really going to generate more confidence, every budget should increase the ratings that the ratings agencies give to the government. Does this happen? No. Every one of these little needles that shows us a budget event, or in fact the IMF ECU European Commission intervention, the loan programme, each attempt at a budgetary correction actually worsens the ratings that the Irish sovereign debt gets. And so, as the ratings worsen, this is shown in inverse proportion now, worse goes up there, the cost of borrowing to the government goes up. And so we get into a worse and worse situation. Is it injecting confidence into consumers? Well, I needn't say any more about that because Eamonn has already described to us the ways in which this is simply not happening. This logic is simply not applicable in the present circumstances. So what we're forced to look at is the European context. So what we have is, at the European level, we see an evolving politics of European integration, of the coordination of fiscal policy, fiscal oversight, at the same time as all these countries that are forced to manage austerity are doing it in a synchronized way, which is intensifying the spillover effects country by country. And the IMF is making great play of this these days, trying to point out to the European Commission and to the ECB that the spillover effect is intensifying the effect for each country. If everyone is doing this together, they're all contracting without generating any possibility of growth on a cross-border basis. So in the middle, we have crisis management that's not being addressed. We know the kinds of things that need to be done. We need some security on borrowing capabilities. We need some risk pooling. We need some help on banks. We need help on recapitalization of banks above and beyond what the ECB has been able to do, risk mutualization. We need fiscal transfers. We need all these things. It's extraordinarily difficult because the politics of getting it done at EU level is very difficult, and there's no real appetite for it in nation-state level, and yet the kinds of things that might be done in the interim to bridge the crisis across the Eurozone are simply not happening because politically it's too difficult to coordinate across nations, and we're left in this very difficult situation. On the day that the EU was noted as having won the Nobel Prize for Peace, the Financial Times couldn't help itself and pointed out that, well, as you can see. Okay, and then my fourth point about the political sustainability of this, the legitimacy of this. See, the thing is that if you have austerity in place for a few years in order to bring down costs and improve competitiveness, this might actually happen. If you can't devalue, then bringing down costs in one country relative to other countries is the way to get back into the competitiveness game. But there are two problems about that. Three problems, I guess. One is that if every country is doing it together, they're trying to play beggar my neighbour, and it's really, really difficult to win enough of a game relative to everybody else to be ahead of the game. And then I think the more general problem is that it is really difficult to keep in place, because you need to do it for 5 to 10 years if you're going to enforce. If you're going to enforce a total reduction in costs across the whole economy, it's not just something that will happen in 1 or 2 years. So the second problem is that it's a long-term problem. You might be able to do it over a 5 to 10 year period if you can't devalue. Then pushing down costs through imposing austerity is technically one way to go. But the third and most serious problem is that political resistance will arise long before you will achieve whatever gains you might think could be brought about, because people simply won't put up with it. People simply don't want to be treated as items in a balance sheet or as inputs into production activities. And so we find political resistance emerging and spilling out onto the streets in one country after another. And this is in fact Madrid this morning, Florence this morning, Greece last year, Portugal 2 weeks ago. This is also from Madrid, and you can see they're blaming Merkel, they're blaming the EU, blaming Draghi. I was looking for an Irish one. We're not very good at getting out on the streets. A lot of pain and suffering, there's a lot of resistance, a lot of hostility. There is a bit of street protest, so just for the sake of completeness, we have our guys in there. So what's happening is that the trust in national governments is eroding, and this, it seems to me, is very serious for democracies. If you take trust in government, the total numbers who trust in government as opposed to the total numbers who tend not to trust in government, you take the difference between them. In other words, this is net trust in government. Look at this. Just in the last few years, the aggregate numbers are falling way down below, minus 40%. In the 4 countries that are under greatest economic duress and experience the worst of austerity, Ireland is the thick purple one there. We had a spike in increased confidence in government with the change of government at the election, but the experience of austerity, the fact that we can change the government but we can't change the policies, makes people very, very unhappy. And you'll see I've put in Germany there as a comparator, and you can see that the net trust in government is still fairly high. I mean, it's in the negative range, but it's much, much higher than elsewhere in Europe. And that is really dangerous for democracy, because if people believe that there's such dissociation between what the people want to see in terms of policy and what the governments are actually able to deliver in terms of policy, that's potentially quite destabilising for democracy. And it's not clear how long this can last. And we see now in Greece that the shredding of the social fabric with austerity is giving rise to, mobilising scope for the extreme right. And it's becoming quite a serious political force in Greek politics. And I think we ignore these trends at our peril. And more generally, then, we're seeing an erosion of trust in the EU itself. I'm sorry about this graph, it's a little bit blurry. I didn't have time to make my own timeline chart, so I've just borrowed this from somebody else. But you can see that the general trend here. The collapse in trust in the EU, the collapse in the confidence that the EU is a good thing, and the scope that this offers for the rise of Euroscepticism is, I think, very serious. So what is to be done? Well, this is where we are now. The politics is very unclear, both at national and at EU level. But there is one group of young people who thought that they had the answer. So we have to wait to see. Thank you.